We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today we'll be doing a mini episode all about beards in Christadelphia. However, unfortunately, I've never grown a beard before, as I am a cisgender woman, so I asked for a volunteer from our ex-Christadelphian community, and one former brother with an exceptional beard has agreed to join me for this episode. I'd like to introduce Mako. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Zinnia.
So I just want to ask you a few quick questions before we begin. Even though we're not doing a personal interview today, do you want to share where in the world you are and how long it's been since you left Christadelphia?
Sure. Yeah, I'm in Texas, and I left officially around 3 years ago. We'd had a ecclesia meeting at my house for years before that, and around 4 years ago, I had kind of told them, we can't do this anymore.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, my beliefs had changed by that point, and it was really the year after that I just was like, I can't anymore.
And then while you were a Christadelphian, did you have this beard, or is this new since you left in the last few years?
I started with a goatee in 2000, and it would gradually go back and forth between a goatee and a beard.
Okay.
So yeah, there's always been something on my chin.
Very nice. All right. So long time commitment to that beard. I'm curious, did you ever notice a difference in how people treated you or acted around you when you had a beard compared to when you didn't or didn't have facial hair? Because I do remember one time a cousin telling me, who was a manager, that his employees treated him different and kind of listened more or almost seemed a little more intimidated by him when he had a beard. Have you ever found anything like that?
I do think I get a little more respect with a beard compared to when I had a goatee. Because with a goatee, it's like, you're shaggy, you're a hippie. But
like
with a beard,
Scooby-Doo shaggy?
yeah. Well, with a beard, now I'm, Sigmund Freud. It's like there's a little more. They don't.
So you think it makes you look like an intellectual?
Idiot. Yeah, I feel like people don't. They don't know I'm an idiot before I talk, at least.
Oh, well, there you go. Interesting. Okay, I was just curious about it, if you ever noticed anything with how that goes, with just the perception of a person with a beard. And then when you were in an ecclesia, how did they handle people with beards? Was it any issue at all? Because it would have been more recent than some people in the Facebook group.
Yeah, in Texas it was always fine, but I did go to Australia in 2000, and there it was still sort of a stigma on people having beards. Like even my goatee was a little bit kind of talked about at the Bible school I was at. Which was funny because there was one guy who had an enormous beard, but it was like fine for him.
Huh.
But I had long hair when I went, and I think that was actually more of a big deal than anything else.
Yeah, that's just like a faux pas.
Yeah. I ended up getting it cut at the Bible school.
Was it because of the pressure?
It was really weird. I expected there to be a lot of pressure, but it was like there was so little pressure. There was more like, because I was foreign, I guess I got a pass.
I would think.
It was weird, like the weird cult mentality, I was like, oh, they were really nice to me, so you know what, I'll do something for them, and I'll cut this gorgeous mane of hair.
Wow.
So stupid, but I did it.
That's so weird, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely feels like peer pressure, even if it wasn't like vocalized, but being in a very, very large group, being a little bit more in a vulnerable place, being somewhere that's not with home, not with your regular community, I feel like that definitely sounds like you were influenced by them.
It's really weird. That sort of human nature where it's like if someone tells you to do something, you don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But if they just,
like,
I don't know, if they're nice to you, if they suggest it nicely, then it's like, okay, maybe I will.
As long as the final say is on you, even if the idea was theirs. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That's really interesting. Yeah, because I'm also in the States and I don't remember it being something that I heard about very much. There was a lot of brothers in my ecclesia that had had beards growing up and, at the time that I left. So I was surprised that we had a lot of feedback on this because this week I posted that I wanted to talk about beards. I mean, we all know there's some beards I got my eye on, some unattached beard. And when I mentioned that the topic was coming up in our ex-Christadelphian Facebook group, the thread exploded with comments, with people sharing stories of different brothers' beards and how polarizing it was in the ecclesias. So I was surprised, and I wanted to dive a little bit into that before we get into a bit of history. So some people shared that they knew of ecclesias that tried to ban beards. Full-on ban, no one can have any. Some said that the topic was so polarizing and so heated that some ecclesias nearly split over the issue of whether brothers could or could not have beards.
Literally splitting hairs.
Yes, good joke.
Splitting facial hairs.
And this is why I need guests on the podcast. All right, and then some people mentioned that they were presented with scriptural reasons for why you have to shave. Some mentioned being banned from speaking on the platform if they grew a beard, but I guess they could go on the platform if they didn't have one. One member of the group said they were familiar with the phrase, grow a beard, leave the truth. So that's an interesting one. And all of that feels really extreme to me because it's just a natural biological thing that happens to half the population. It's just your body changes with hormones, you reach adulthood, and you begin growing facial hair for people with that hormones. And I do have a friend who's trans with an amazing beard, so that's why I'm saying it's more about hormones than rigid gender stuff. You do you. So from what I was reading and from the comments, and they're talking about what time periods their experiences were from, it seems more in the 1900s, which I know wasn't that long ago, but pre-millennium. Christadelphia seemed like it was pretty beard phobic, especially in certain regions and ecclesias, because there's always that diversity among ecclesias. But this seemed to change over time as well, because many people said they haven't seen this as much since 2000. So some people think that this extreme view on beards was really a backlash to the hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s, where men grew long hair like you did with beards. And so it was kind of taking the opposite extreme, where they were kind of distancing themselves from this worldly style. However, this wasn't always the case, and one ex-Christadelphian said he was informed that beards and mustaches were signs of homosexuality, and was told by an arranging brother that facial hair is effeminate. So that was not related to hippies, right?
That's what you call cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it literally doesn't make sense when that is such a trademark of masculinity.
Wow.
Yeah, I literally can't do that because I am too feminine.
See, this is a real cultural divide, I think, because I grew up in Texas, and being macho is a whole thing here, you know?
Yeah, everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, growing beards and getting muscles, I mean, it's what you do. And I know there's a lot of that in Australia, too. They're really macho there, too. So that is really surprising to me that they were that against beards. It's weird.
Yeah.
At least only in the Christadelphian realm, I think. I would imagine most Australians would be, totally cool with beards and all that macho stuff.
Any Australians are welcome to tag in on that because we're theorizing. But yeah, I definitely am surprised by that comment. It was one person that threw that out there. Just, as I said, literally doesn't make sense to me since women can't grow beards.
Yeah, it's got to be some dodgy British influence kind of thing.
Maybe,
the ties at church, were required. Okay. Coats and ties, even for I went to one midweek Bible talk or something, and
really?
I just showed up in the button-up shirt with no tie, and they're like, "Oh, you got to put a tie on." I'm like, "What?"
In Texas?
So they gave me this was in Australia.
Oh, okay, in Australia. Because I was it is hot in Texas, man.
Oh yeah. No, we were,
and that's a Thursday night.
Well, also, I mean, I'm from Austin, which is the liberal.
I love Austin. Yeah, that is the
so
more liberal area. Keep Austin weird.
Yeah, our ecclesia was a little different. I mean, if I was in East Texas or West Texas or in North Texas, and I had long hair, it would be kind of probably a problem.
Yeah, And again, that's that diversity that we see, and where often the ecclesia's culture is kind of a microcosm of the greater society in where they are. Because I do notice that, at least in America, where they are in the spectrum of liberal to conservative also typically matches the political like area where they are. If you look at like the voting, it's very interesting. But yeah, so it seems interesting to me that we're talking about, it being feminine. So thinking about that a little bit more, I was like, okay, well, someone that doesn't have a lot of facial hair, I would say they're a little more resemblance to a woman's than a guy that has, the facial hair. And I don't mean to say they look like a woman necessarily, but it's like if you were going to do drag as a man, it would make your life easier if you shaved your face. If you're doing your makeup, you're putting on your wig and bra, you'd have to downplay the beard a little bit. Some drag queens keep it, most don't. So, it's just a little bit more close to the illusion they're going for. So
Illusion's a good word.
Yes. I was trying to brainstorm when I was thinking about this because I just went off on a tangent, and I was trying to think of drag names for John Thomas. Do you want to hear them?
Yes. I mean, his name already is a drag name in England. You know what John Thomas is in England?
No.
It's slang for penis.
That sounds right. I was about to say, but I feel like it would be like a Willy joke for Britain.
It's even in Monty Python's Life of Brian.
Oh, I haven't seen that in so long.
John Thomas. Yeah.
That's
not Life of Brian. Miracle of Life.
Oh my God. But I was trying to come up with other ones just based on like Christadelphian culture. So the first name is Izzy, and that's Izzy baptized. And I got another one. First name Hope. Hopo Israel.
Oh my God.
Those are ones I came up with. I saw one online that was also really good, and it was Lord's Prayer. All spelled out like the name Lord. And I was like, I like it. That's a clever one.
You got to do something with Elpis Israel, like Ellie.
I was trying. My mind went there too, but it's. Do you know how hard it is to work Elpis into?
It's a hard one.
Modern language.
Eureka. Eureka.
I feel like if I put it in the Facebook group, someone will have a brilliant idea, but that was the best I came up with. So, yeah, I just thought that was a fun little side note as we started talking about gender and beards. Like, you know what? Let's figure out his drag name. So, if you want to go back to talking about beards, there was only one exception to the anti-beard stances that were mentioned by ex-Christadelphians. One member said that in their ecclesia, men were required to have beards. And so it was the full opposite end of the spectrum. And
wow. It's like Islam.
Yeah. Like some of those cultures where you have to have the beard and all of the men just have this long beard. I don't know if they had to keep it long or they could like trim it and just had to have something. But I assume none of them were firemen because you're literally not allowed to have it. A lot of cops can't, but I guess that's why Christadelphians don't do those things.
It's funny. Speaking of that, is my dad was a fireman in the 80s, and he actually led like a local movement to get the firefighters allowed to have mustaches.
Yeah,
that
the mustaches
as facial hair could go. But like before that, it was not even a mustache. So, I mean, facial hair is like a big thing, I guess, in my family.
And they want to have it, and that's understandable. And usually they do it for life. So being a fireman is like a life commitment to shaving every day. But I've been to a firefighter convention, and I always joke that it's the mustache convention because that's all they can have. So they're either clean shaved or have a mustache. So that was just weird.
Probably thank my dad for that, for some of those guys.
You never know.
He fought for that. Yeah.
I'm glad that he fought for that, but unfortunately they can't have anything on the cheeks. They gotta shave that still. Yeah. It just seems weird that, they're all reading the same Bible, they're all the same religion, such a broad spectrum and such strong opinions on beards across ecclesias historically. It seems like if the Bible was really specific about beards and whether men need one or not for their salvation, you would think that would be like presented in a really clear way where there's no confusion about whether it's good or bad or relevant, because I don't think it does much for your character.
It's such a weird thing because it was very clear that every dude had a beard. Every Jewish guy had a beard.
Did they Did they go to the store and just like buy a razor? I was like, weren't they wandering a desert at one point?
Well, their beards are described, and in one of the David stories or one of the King stories, some of the Jewish soldiers got captured and half of their beards were shaved off, and it was like the most scandalous thing. They had to come back to town with their faces covered up because it was such a scandal to have no facial hair on half of their face.
Just like humbling all these men by attacking the beards. Yeah, I feel like that seems like a pro-beard movement right in there. Yeah, that feels very pro-beard. All right, ready to move on to history a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, can't wait. So if you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, then you know I don't really get into the theology side too much, but I do want to talk a little bit about the history of beards, and so we'll talk about some within Christadelphia. So by now, I mean, you all know I have got my eye on a specific beard. We discussed in episode 8 that the founder of the Christadelphians had a long white beard at the time of his death, and that Robert Roberts cut it off and pocketed it at his funeral. And its whereabouts are still unknown. Anyone with information is asked to please tell me because I'm dying to know what happened to it. But if we stop for 1 second there, let's just realize that Robert Roberts saw John Thomas's beard as not just a beard or as a fashion choice, but he was so attached to the beard itself that he wanted it even without the body. It was so iconic that it's how he wanted to remember the doctor. And the beard needed its own episode. So, and if you're that Christadelphian brother who thinks that beards are for homosexuals, you can write that bisexual fanfic about John Thomas and Robert Roberts since they both had beards.
Ooh. Hefty.
And I have a surprise history fact for you about Robert Roberts' beard. Do you have any guesses as to what it is?
It was fake. It was a toupee on his face.
Well, that would be so dorky. I think that would have been included by his biographer.
He was a trans man the whole time wearing a fake beard.
That would be so riveting. As far as I know, that's not the case, though. But I love that guess, and it's welcome. So Robert Roberts only had a beard because he wanted to look like John Thomas. Yeah.
Wow.
When I say he was obsessed with his beard, like this makes the beard snatching make a little more sense.
But we're not a cult. They weren't a cult.
Never.
Not a cult.
Absolutely. No. I don't see what you're talking about there. Like I don't even know how you could construe that. Did idolize the beard a little bit. It may have been an idol. You know, he was doing some idol worship. And also what's funny is his was red, according to his biographer, Islip Collier, while the doctor's was apparently jet black when he was younger. So unfortunately, he couldn't even grow the black beard.
Well, that's okay, though, because since Christadelphians don't believe in souls and gingers don't have souls, I mean, it fits right in with the theology.
I have so many friends that are gingers, so if they're listening, just ignore the mean man over here.
For the record, I don't think anybody has a soul, so gingers aren't excluded.
Okay,
there.
all right. All right, so let's continue. From a historical perspective, the beard was actually a strong choice for the time, apparently. What I found was that at the time, a clean-shaven face was the standard for religious leaders of the day. So this, like, thick, long beard made him stand out from the more stereotypical religious leaders of the day. It was just unusual for someone preaching to an audience to have a beard, and so it actually stuck out to people. It even became iconic, and the doctor was known for his beard, and that's why I kept finding historical references to it. So here's one example. One evening, Dr. Thomas was permitted to preach alongside a Methodist preacher to a Methodist audience, which, as far as I know, doesn't happen that often. But this article was recorded in his magazine, The Herald, in 1856. And the writer wrote that, quote, "I am sure had you been there, you would have marveled mightily, and have had no little amaze to have seen Brother Thomas on a Methodist platform, sitting alongside of the preacher. A stranger might have supposed that one of the ancients had appeared in rebuke of Methodism, this being as beardless as the doctor's is luxuriant. And you may depend upon it their attention was riveted. All eyes were fixed on him, and many with open mouths," unquote.
Skip to the part where they kiss.
Right? I mean, every time you read it, like Robert Roberts especially writing about it, but this one wasn't Robert Roberts, they're always like, man, this man, like they'll always like throw like all these little compliments in. They'll be like, his brain was just so smart. His beard was so luxurious. So while his talk rebuking Methodism may have been so riveting, that's not really what the writer is focused on here. It seems like the beard was what was drawing the attention of the crowd, and it illustrated that this guy was a different type of religious leader than that smooth-faced Methodist preacher. But also, maybe he just wanted his feminine hands on that luxurious beard, because it sounds like there was some serious beard envy or like a little crush, getting started. Another example I found of his beard being featured in stories about him, John Thomas, was in the March 1852 edition of the Herald. Thomas published a short exchange that he had with a young boy as they passed by someone who spoke another language that the doctor didn't know. Because they didn't speak the same language, the doctor asked the boy what the man had said. Apparently, the boy replied that, "They set a great eye upon you, sir." And so the doctor said, "How so?" And the boy goes, "Because of the beard you wear." And so, like, this man speaking another language was, like, gossiping about his beard. I was like, who is that? Like, that stud. And so, once again, like, people in other cultures were curious about him. This beard was very, like, exotic, unusual.
And who reported that translation, by the way?
Oh, this is all him.
Yeah.
He never missed a chance to publish feedback about his beard, which is why I have material to work with 150 years later.
I mean, that's the guy who said the checkout girl was totally flirting with me.
Oh, you think he was just making it up for attention? He's like, everyone thinks I'm such a stud. See, it says so in my magazine I published about myself. I mean, I can neither confirm nor deny. I mean, do people stare at your beard?
I get compliments, but it's always dudes.
It's always dudes.
Yeah. So maybe there is, a little smoke to that fire.
They're like, "Hey, man, what are you doing later after the
Wink,
working out the
wink.
gym, bro?"
Nice beard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it could be. You never know. You never know. Okay, so for those people who look to John Thomas to tell them how to live in the present day, he did actually share his opinion on beards in his magazine. And I'm sure you won't be surprised as to what it was, since his beard was so legendary in his life and on this podcast. All right, so in 1853, the doctor included a piece of non-Christadelphian writing in his magazine. So he republished something in his magazine, The Herald. And once again, it's just an example of him reprinting something from another religious magazine. So he was obviously well-read in religious writing. Just pointing that out there again. So the article he republished in 1853 was entitled, "Why Israelites Were Forbidden to Shave," which he reprinted from what it said was the Journal of Sacred Literature, but he didn't mention the author or what edition, so I haven't dug through to find the exact edition yet. So I'm quoting him. And while it may have simply been an interesting piece of writing on Jewish history, it's more likely that it drew his attention because it reinforced what he already believed, and even better, he didn't have to do the work to research and write the article himself. So basically, publishing other writings from people was kind of like the 1800s version of sharing a post you agree with on your feed to social media. So he's like, "Oh yeah, like I really believe in this. I'm just going to like share it to my story." But it was his magazine. So since he was devoted to his beard, he's like, "Yeah, I'll share an article related to beards in the Bible and like why men shouldn't shave their facial hair." And I don't really recommend reading it because it feels like a confusing racist ramble. The main point at the end was basically a Bible verse in Leviticus saying you shouldn't cut the corners of your beard off. Okay. And because clearly Christadelphians are living like Israelites in the desert, carrying their belongings, slaughtering animals regularly, wearing clothes of certain fabrics, and so on, except they're not doing any of that. So,
Well, in Texas, we do hunt and we do all wear denim. So.
Yeah, you think you'd make the cut? You could live a Leviticus lifestyle?
I think so.
And on that note, I've seen some articles about how there's not really any evidence for Jews wandering the desert for 40 years and how the distance they traveled then could have been covered in 11 days, and that there's no evidence that Hebrews were slaves to Egyptians. So it's interesting that they're like, "Oh, we're going to go with this one verse from Leviticus as proof that this is how we should live our lives now." And I was like, I don't even know if that time period actually existed when this was supposed to be written. So interesting choice. But eventually, I found an instance of Dr. John Thomas mentioning his beard himself, and he wasn't just reprinting what someone else said or anything like that. So apparently someone had published something about him in a magazine called The Reformer's Gazette. And that person probably had a sense of humor, which is kind of nice. And he seems to have presented John Thomas as a smart guy despite having a big beard. Even the title of the article pissed off Thomas because it was called "The Pope and Dr. Thomas the Prophet." which pissed him off. He's like, I'm not a prophet. But in the article, they wrote that, quote, Dr. Thomas was a grave, sedate, and bearing his long black beard, a very respectable looking personage. And he joked that, quote, whether his wisdom lay in his long beard, we know not, unquote. So like he like went in on the beard. He's like, that is the only thing I cannot handle. I cannot respect this man with this beard. Is that where all of his wisdom comes from? Like he just starts joking around about his beard. And John Thomas got upset that this guy had basically said his beard wasn't respectable. So he published a reply in his magazine to kind of throw a punch back. The article was called Bearded Wisdom, which I love as a title. In his reply, he wrote, quote, the editor's allusion to our beard is quite amusing. He seems to demur to the respectability of its appearance. If the editor of the Gazette preferred to appear like a beardless boy all the days of his life, our admiration of puerility is not so extreme as his. The gravity, heroism, dignity, and excellence of the ancient world are with the beard. The levity, effeminacy, dandyism, and servility of all ages with the smooth-laced shaveling of ignoble men. In these days when mankind is struggling to attain its manhood, the beard asserts its right to appear in all its fullness upon the human face divine. It is the symbol of manly thought and action uncontrolled by human imbecility, and therefore it is prescribed by the Pope, and held in disrepute by all who look up to them as the respectabilities of the age. We can, however, assure our friend the editor that whatever wisdom we may be supposed to possess is not consequent upon the wearing of our beard, but our refusal any longer to inflict punishment upon our face and feelings from mere conformity to ridiculous and tyrant custom is the result of it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was mad about that article.
He sounds like one of those alpha male podcasters.
I actually thought this while I was reading it. It was all like this machismo stuff and the world is losing its manliness. Like we have to be extra manly now to like take something back. Like I don't know what it is, but something they want back.
He's like Andrew Tate of the 1800s.
Yes.
I was just expecting the next line to be something about like a beard tonic that he sells, you know?
Don't give it away just yet. We're going to have a special advertisement in this episode. And this is also like a good example of John Thomas just being mean. Like he's just ready to throw down over this guy, like making a joke at him and throwing a little shade over his beard. But like I'm so glad that this guy provoked him because now I get to read John Thomas articulating how he really feels about beards on men. And this is our thesis for the episode today. I'm sure plenty of Christadelphians who are on the no beard side of the argument would be shocked to hear how John Thomas would view them. John Thomas just said his beard and beards in general represent heroism, manliness, and dignity. Meanwhile, the men with shaved faces, which was apparently the majority of Christadelphians, effeminate, which we kind of talked about with like the homosexuality and that kind of thing, ridiculous, tyrannical, calling them mere boys, dandies, conformists, and his worst insult as usual, associated with the Pope and Catholicism, because he just could not handle the Catholics. And so like the word choices are a bit dated, kind of pretentious. It's pretty clear where he stood on beards. Like this was pro beards at meetings, starting with his own. And I think he would have been very pro beard on any of those splits.
This whole thing is about not being a vain dandy, but he's being so vain about it. It's just
Yep. He loved that beard. I almost wonder, like, if he woke up, like, resurrected and his beard was missing and he looked over at Robert Roberts, who was buried next to him, and was like, you fucking took it? Like, can you imagine that look of, like, this was my beard. This is my pride and joy. What did you do? He's just like, God was supposed to fix it when he resurrected you. I didn't mean to. I can't even imagine that drama. He's like, that was my beard, man. That was my masculinity you just stripped off. And so going back to Robert Roberts again, try to picture him reading this Bearded Wisdom article. Like he was so obsessed with John Thomas ever since he was little that reading something like this would have made a huge impression. Because as we learned in episode 8, Roberts would do absolutely anything that he thought would please John Thomas. So of course, when he reads this, he would grow a beard. Otherwise, John Thomas would take one look at him and call him a dandy. So he was going to be a nonconformist like John Thomas. Whereas, like, otherwise he'd be like, oh, you're just a conformist who shaved their face because the Catholics do it.
This is so relevant because that's how kids are today that are listening to these podcasters. They're like, oh, well, if he sees me, being a beta, he's going to
that's the phrasing, the alpha beta
me.
thing. Isn't it crazy? Yeah. And it is sad that toxic masculinity is so relevant. We have not gotten past it. We're still dealing with it. Yep. And John Thomas, in case you're wondering, was one of those guys.
Oh, yeah. You
can really see it. So for most of his life, John Thomas had that distinctive black beard. Dr. Thomas's beard is also what Robert Roberts remembered about John Thomas when he first saw him when he was 10 years old. Roberts recorded the memory in his autobiography, My Days and My Ways. He wrote that while he and his brothers were watching Thomas speak, they were more taken with his beard than his lecture. When he recounted it later, he wrote that the beard, quote, was a novelty in those days, unquote. And afterward, he and his brothers, quote, vowed we should never shave, unquote, because they were so influenced by him before they were even able to grow a beard, 10 years old. They vowed to never shave. Like, talk about an influencer of that era. Yeah. And honestly, I don't even think we should be surprised at this point that Roberts only had a beard because John Thomas had one, because their dynamic kind of feels like a child trying to imitate their dad and like make him proud of him. He's like, I'll do anything, I'll just make you love me.
Like, what do we know about Robert Roberts' relationship with his dad?
He did not show up in the autobiography very much, so minimal. Yeah, he may have needed to see a therapist instead of joining a religion. So that distinctive black beard that John Thomas had made a lifelong impression on Robert Roberts starting in his childhood. Though what's actually funny is that Robert Roberts didn't actually meet John Thomas formally in person until much later in his life when the doctor returned to Europe for a preaching tour. By that time, Roberts was an enthusiastic supporter of Thomas. At that time, Roberts was waiting eagerly for the upcoming visit, and he began having dreams about meeting the doctor. When he considered what he knew about what the doctor looked like, in the age before social media and all that kind of stuff, he said that the engraving in his book, Elpis Israel, showed a man with a black beard and a full head of hair. However, when Roberts did finally spot the doctor in a crowd after he arrived in Europe, Robert described him in his autobiography as, quote, a white-bearded, military-looking gentleman, unquote. Fortunately, Roberts still recognized him with the white beard, but it was actually mentioned in several other sources that some people considered him unrecognizable with the white beard after knowing him when he was younger for the black one. And I'm sure if he was alive in modern times, he probably would have colored it, because I also agree. I think he was pretty vain about it.
For sure.
Yeah. So that was all kind of essentially the backstory for what led up to Robert Roberts cutting off that sexy old man beard during Thomas's funeral and doing who knows what with it during his lifetime. And for anyone who missed it in episode 8, here's the quote again from the July 1871 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, which describes the scene at John Thomas's funeral. Robert Roberts, quote, expressed that a portion of the doctor's beautiful beard might be rescued from the worms as a memento of affection. Accordingly, the upper portion of the lid being once more removed, the editor, with a pair of scissors with which he had provided himself, rapidly performed the necessary operation, removing the principal portion of the beard and wrapping it in a piece of paper, unquote. So yeah, that's when he interrupted the service to pocket that beard. Can you blame him? He'd been eyeing that beard since he was 10. 10 years old, he's like, I want that beard.
Listen to the language he uses, too.
The affection?
He was such a wannabe John Thomas that he's pretending like he's a surgeon himself, performing this surgery
an operation?
On his body. Yeah.
That's actually an interesting perspective. I do like that. It's insightful. I do wonder. But it's also the 1800s, and sometimes they just kind of talk in a very verbose way, just adding in all the extra words they could come up with. So I don't know if he was just being creative with it. But yeah, his beautiful beard, as he said, is a memento of affection. I was like, you just wanted that beard. I don't know. So
I can just imagine his grandkids finding a ball of this white hair and being like, what the hell is this?
But then they would have thrown it away. And I was like, okay.
Exactly.
But like Victorians were also known for making art out of it. And so sometimes they had it like framed artwork. And I was like, well, did they at least like write on the back, like, hey, like I made a little like heart and like glued it to a piece of paper and like on the back, right, like John Thomas's beard. Like, where did it go?
Well, also think about, so Robert Roberts, he lived in England, right?
He did. He was born in Scotland, moved to England to set up the Christadelphia magazine, and then retired kind of to Australia. So that was his trajectory.
Going back to how John Thomas is a euphemism for a penis, and if you see a box labeled John Thomas hair, you'd be like, oh my God, Grandpa saved his pubes.
No. Yeah, that would have been real bad if it was in England and they're just like, But I feel like in Christadelphia, they would have known, right? Probably would have been labeled like the Doctor, like what remains of the Doctor, 1871. But I feel like Robert Roberts, he was able to be organized enough to run this Christadelphian magazine. He was obsessed with John Thomas. He had to have done something meaningful with it during his lifetime, right? Like, it's not like he would have like forgotten about it or like dropped it off the side of the boat, you know, like
he ate it.
Ew, no. Please tell me that's not what happened. So we don't know what happened to the beard.
That's the cleanest one I can think of.
Don't want to know the dirty ones then. Oh no. The other theories that I have heard, the main one that I heard that people were really pro was the Victorian one. And I did Google it, and I'll share a link in the podcast episode notes, where they would keep the hair from someone who died and put it into jewelry or make art out of it that looked kind of nice. One funny theory that someone put out in the ex-Christadelphian Facebook group was maybe he put it into the paper that Elpis Israel was printed on to like make it holy. And I don't think that was what happened. Like, we're not saying any of these theories are true, but in the absence of an answer as to where it went, the theories will multiply. So, are you ready to take a quick break from this episode for a word from our sponsor?
Yes.
This advertisement is for the manly men. You know, the ones who get things done, chopping wood, going hunting, and even growing a beard. We get it. Life is a challenge for manly men like you, which is why caring for your beard shouldn't be. With Uncle Johnny's Beard Oil, you can protect and strengthen your beard to ensure it stays healthy for a lifetime. Uncle Johnny's Beard Oil is made with only the finest organic snake oil, and we've definitely had our product tested by a reputable third party. Anyways, don't worry about that. Just trust us on this one, like you do everything else. With Uncle Johnny's Beard Oil, your beard will become the talk of your community. Don't believe us? Call us for your free sample that will auto-renew with a monthly subscription payment of $99.99. Let's be honest. Real men have beards, and with Uncle Johnny's Beard Oil, people won't be able to take their hands off your beard. Literally. Terms and conditions may apply. Side effects include rashes, homosexuality, obsessive fans of your beard, and the theft of your beard after death. Call today for your free sample of Uncle Johnny's Beard Oil. And now, back to the show.
I'm ordering some of that beard oil right now. Do y'all take Bitcoin?
Of course. I think John Thomas would have loved Bitcoin. But so I personally really enjoy this sort of research into the history of people we think we know, because it takes figures whose reputations have been polished and censored over time. And in this case, these are really these prominent men in Christadelphian history. It takes them off the pedestal that they were placed on, and we can begin to see their personality, understand a bit about who they are, what they were about, what their values were, and things like that. And these historical facts remind us that they were just people too, and were influenced by the time period and society in which they lived as well. John Thomas was an outspoken, aggressive man who took pride in being different and being recognizable with his beard back in the day. His beard was probably almost counterculture, kind of like hippies in the 1960s, actually. And then you have Robert Roberts, who was always looking for ways to please John Thomas and live his life in a way that would keep him close to John Thomas in a very weird but most likely heterosexual way. And again, this research into beards, and more so the beards of John Thomas and Robert Roberts in Christadelphian history, is interesting just because John Thomas is the founder of Christadelphians. He's the first Christadelphian. He and Robert Roberts set the template for what a good Christadelphian should be. I heard their names mentioned so many times growing up, and other ex-Christadelphians have mentioned learning about them, reading their books, and growing up with pictures of them in their houses as well as in their ecclesias. And so if we go back to our conversation from the beginning of this episode about the experiences that many men had within modern ecclesias, being told that having a beard means they can't speak in the ecclesia, they're too feminine, or they're gay, they're disappointing God, whatever. It's interesting that the culture and tradition of more modern Christadelphians has changed so much since its founding. Like, Christadelphian tradition has shifted so far from what was established by its founder and his most loyal follower to the point that 100 or more years later, many of the brothers worldwide aren't living in alignment or weren't living in alignment with what Dr. Thomas believed in that regard. Can you believe that? Christadelphians were not looking to the writings of John Thomas for guidance. And then it could be even more interesting because if Christadelphians begin to diverge on this subject that John Thomas believed in, whether because of this Bible verse about not trimming your beards or just because he liked the attention it got him, what other beliefs that John Thomas had could Christadelphians change or get rid of? Typically, members would look to him or Roberts for guidance on issues, and the entire religion is really based on the beliefs that he published and wrote. But from what I've heard from ex-Christadelphians, many ecclesias have diverged over this over the years, although that issue seems to have more recently lost some of its fire. Regardless of what you believe socially or culturally about beards, I hope today you enjoyed learning more about beards in Christadelphia, and in particular, about the legendary missing beard of Dr. John Thomas. Thank you for coming on this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being so open to chatting about beards, to learning about beards, to being asked probing questions about your beard that you probably never expected to be asked, and so on.
Do you have any other topics that were like weird for Christadelphians to be into? I probably took part in those too.
That could be fun. If anyone has any ideas, you can reach out to me and maybe I'll add it to my list of things. I already do have a list going, but let me know. Maybe I'll cover it in even like another mini episode like this, because I thought this one was fun, a little more casual than some of the really dense ones with a lot of history in it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that Christadelphians are evolving.
Mm-hmm. I also like that in our episode on women and the thesis that Amy wrote, we talked a lot about why Christadelphians can't change. And then in this episode, talking more about masculinity in the modern era and a little bit, and historically, we're talking about Christadelphians changing in one regard. So it's been very interesting doing some of these gender-specific episodes. Either way, I thank you so much for coming on today. I thought it was fun. Definitely more fun having you on than me just doing this by myself. Thanks for the excellent jokes as well throughout. So thank you, Mako, for joining me today. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for this fun mini episode on beards. And we'll see you next time on the Life After Leaving podcast. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.